Alright, this is the third video on confidentiality, and here we're going to talk a little bit about why confidentiality makes beginning social workers a little nervous, because it is really important, and it is something that you could, for breaches in confidentiality, something you could lose your license for. New social workers and students are often like, but who can I tell? What can I talk about? How do I disguise this? And the best policy is there's very little that you can talk about, quite honestly. And you're like, but what if I want to tell my mom? No, you can't tell your mom. You can talk very broadly about things, like you could say, well, I had a hard day, or I have a lot of home visits today. But your family should know very, very little about you or your clients. For instance, this year I'm practicing social work again. And all my family really knows is that I'm working for Children's Services, and that I have a caseload mostly of third graders who are having problems at school, specifically around the third grade reading guarantee. And that's all they know. They know they're in foster care. They don't know any of the details about anything that's happening to them. If something goes wrong at work, it's not something I talk about with my family at home. So it's really, you have to learn how to cope with your coworkers and your supervisor, as well as just blocking things off in your head, that there is a place that it's just not other people's business. Another thing that makes new social workers really nervous is the things that we can't break confidentiality for. So for instance, if a client is beating his or her partner, we can't call the police on that. We can encourage the victim of domestic violence to get help, and we can talk through and support him or her in making phone calls and reporting that. But we do not call the police and say, listen, I have a client whose boyfriend's beating her. That's not our place. We do not, if somebody says, oh, I'm using drugs, we don't act on that. We don't, if somebody is embezzling money, unless it's from an older adult, and that makes them a vulnerable population, we don't do anything. So crime, unless it falls under the category of imminent risk to someone else, and by imminent I mean they're going to die, or it's a protected population, they're abusing children, then we act. But other than that, there's a lot of bad behaviors that clients disclose to us that does not warrant a breach of information. One example would be if I'm working with a couple and one of the people tells me that they're having an affair and they're coming to me for marital work. That's not something I can breach. I can talk about how false it is that we're doing treatment around this if they're not honest. I can encourage them to disclose that, but it's not my place. This also gets really tricky when we're dealing with adolescents, specifically around issues that it would be helpful if parents know, for instance, an unplanned pregnancy. One of the things that I typically do in this case is work with the client so that they can tell their parent or whoever it is they need to tell in a safe space while I'm there. So we might spend a couple of weeks coaching on how we're going to tell mom and dad that. And so I would be there while the client is actually disclosing their problem, and that's totally fine. That way you kind of act as a buffer so that you're able to deal with any potential fallout that occurs, but it's actually the client then who's telling what they think is the secret, and I'm not having to breach that. Having said that, anything that you put in your notes of a minor, so any records that I'm keeping for a child, their parents have the right to see those notes. And so you've got to be additionally cautious as you write those notes, because the parents are the guardians and the ones who have signed for medical record treatment. They're the ones who say, yes, you may treat my child. And so because of that, they technically have a right to see that. So if that ever happens, you work with your supervisor about how you have to show that record and what records you may or may not be able to show. So there are some ways around that. But these are things that make new social workers nervous. They're tricky situations, And it always, anytime we're talking about confidentiality and having to break it, the best policy for new social workers is staff it with your supervisor and get some advice from somebody who's worked a long time. I'd much rather have somebody come to me and say, is this something I can break confidentiality for or not? And walk me through why that happens, because you're always safer when you staff an ethical issue with a supervisor, and so that's certainly the case in breaking confidentiality. In the next video, we're going to talk about what to say to clients about confidentiality and kind of the spiel that you'll be asked to give when you talk with clients at the start of assessment. We'll also review this again at the start of the assessment videos, but we'll give you a little preview of that as well.